The most important part of any reef tank is the filtration. And in today's episode, we're going to be going through everything you need to know to set up the perfect filtration for your tank. When it comes to filtration, there are a lot of different methods, and there is no perfect solution for every tank. But the standard filtration that we use in saltwater is a sump. This is going to be the best way to filter the tank. It's basically a smaller aquarium under the tank that allows you to cram all your different filtration that we'll get to in a little bit, as well as any sort of extra equipment you want to put in, like a heater. Now, there are a few different methods of filtration other than a sump. The primary one that I recommend is an all-in-one tank, and that's like the one that we are using for our beginner series, where it's basically just a sump in the back of the tank. The other type of filtration you're typically going to see more in freshwater. These include canister filters and hang-on-the-back filters. Now, a canister filter is basically a container that is sealed shut, and it acts very similarly to a sump, where you have all your filtration medias in there, and there's a pump that pumps the water from the aquarium into the canister and then back out into the aquarium. The problem with these is that they are sealed shut, so they're a little harder to maintain, and you can't put in equipment like a protein skimmer that we'll talk about in a little bit. So that can end up leading to a lot more equipment actually inside of your aquarium, which is a little bit more unsightly and sometimes not as effective. The other type is a hang-on-back filter. This is probably your first filter for an aquarium that you had, and it basically just sits on the back of your tank, sucks in water, and then pushes it out, and is very similar to a canister filter in that it just has media sitting inside of it, and you don't really have any space for other equipment, but it is a little bit easier to maintain just because you don't have it sealed shut, so you can actually grab out your media and replace it without having to turn off the filter and remove everything and open it up. So it makes it a lot easier to maintain, but it typically doesn't serve to filter as large of a water volume as a canister filter would. So this is our sump. This is one of the many sumps we have here. This is my dog, Flashy. He's a cutie, isn't he? This is one of the many sumps that we have here at the shop. This system in particular is our online system, so it's where we have all of our corals that are on our website. And we have this sump and actually another 40-gallon breeder sump right next to it that is connected, just to give us more filtration in a little bit more of a compact space. As I said, these are 40-gallon breeder aquariums that we've glued baffles into. Now, what a baffle is it's any sort of glass or acrylic that goes into here and provides a divider between different sections in the sump. So our first section here is going to be our mechanical filtration. So the mechanical filtration basically physically catches things. So this is what's called a filter sock, and it'll physically catch things like food and fish waste that go into the aquarium. And that way you're able to remove them before they break down and start to turn into things like algae and food sources for algae. So that is kind of the first line of defense in cleaning the aquarium. And it's a really good way to also clear out any debris in the tank that could make the tank look a little bit more unsightly. Now, the next key component in filtration is chemical filtration, and I've actually got some of that in my other filter sock, but it's basically a few different things that you can use. The most popular, I would say, would be carbon. Now, carbon is basically just a cleanser. It will help clarify your water, it can remove odors, and basically filters out any pollutants that are in the aquarium. There are other types of chemical filtration like GFO, and basically what they do is they will grab onto some sort of chemical in the aquarium and they'll remove it. So if there's any sort of harmful chemicals in the aquarium, they'll be stripped out and removed before they can do harm to any of your corals, fish, or invertebrates. Next type of filtration, and the most important, is going to be bacterial. So this is things like media balls. These are marine pure spheres. And as you can see, they have a bunch of little holes on them. And this provides a bunch of surface area for bacteria to grow. And what that bacteria does is actually clean the tank and remove things like nitrates and phosphates from the tank. So that way your levels don't get too high where they can be harmful to some of your fish and invertebrates. Now, the other big thing we have in this tank is called a protein skimmer. These are very helpful and useful pieces of equipment, but they're not always necessary for every aquarium. For instance, our 15-gallon upfront isn't going to have one. And the reason for this is it's technically a type of mechanical filtration. And what it does is it has a pump at the bottom that intakes air and aquarium water and mixes them together to make a foam that, as it rises up into this cup, will spill over into this collection cup section and create what is called a protein skim. And what it does is these bubbles attach to proteins in the water, such as fish poop and fish waste or uneaten food, things like that, and it will remove them from the aquarium before they have time to break down and pollute the tank. So the usefulness in this, especially in a larger aquarium, is that water changes are a pain. For our 15-gallon tank up front that we're doing this series on, a 5-gallon bucket of water will change 33%. Now, that is very useful for removing organics and waste because that takes out a third of whatever our levels are at. If our nitrates are at 10, they will go down to 7. And so what that does for us is it quickly removes these nutrients before they have time to build up and become harmful and toxic. Now, in this large system, this one here is about 420 gallons. So to do a 33% water change, we would have to do this much water. And because of that, that is a lot of water. Not only would we need to mix multiple of our jugs in the back, but we would also have to take out a ton of that water and use a bunch of buckets or trash cans to remove it. So it becomes very burdensome, and things like this protein skimmer can help to reduce that burden and make it a lot easier to maintain a larger aquarium. So generally, if your tank is under 40 gallons, I don't really recommend the need for a protein skimmer unless you're going to heavily stock it. The other downside to these smaller protein skimmers is they're not as effective because they don't have the volume to create a good amount of bubbles to really properly clean the tank. They end up becoming more of an accessory than an actual useful piece of equipment on your aquarium. Because of that, I usually only recommend them in tanks about 40 gallons or larger. And I recommend going with a brand like Reef Octopus or Simplicity because they make very good skimmers and they're very high quality. I would typically stay away from brands like East Shops. Their skimmers aren't as good. They don't spend as much time making skimmers. And if the brand makes a lot of other stuff, usually the skimmers aren't as fine-tuned. Brands like Simplicity and Reef Octopus really only make skimmers, and they do a very good job of crafting these skimmers and engineering them to work very well and be very easy to take apart and clean. For instance, this skimmer here only requires 4 nylon screws to be removed in order to clean and service it, which makes it very easy because these things do need to be cleaned quite frequently, usually every 3 to 6 months, because they'll get a lot of buildup. And they can also get different life forms and critters like sponges growing on the inside that can hurt the performance of these. Now, overall, this sump is very simple, and you can definitely have a lot more gadgets. For instance, we'll get into a Refugium a little later on, but this is really all you need to get the basics of your aquarium. A chemical filtration like carbon, mechanical filtration like a filter sock, and then some sort of biological media, whether it's live rock or a sphere like Marine Pure that allows you to get a lot of bacteria growth on it. So this is the other side of our sump. This is the other 40-gallon breeder. It's a very similar setup. We've got our mechanical filtration, also known as our filter sock right here. We've also got some carbon in here. The main difference is going to be this center chamber here. This is a Refugium. Now, what a Refugium is it's basically a place for macroalgae and other sort of organisms like pods. In this case, what we use is Chaeto. So this is a green macroalgae that grows in this sort of ball. And it is a very quick growing macroalgae, which is one of the things you want to look for when you're selecting one. There are some that have more colors, such as Dragon's Breath or our Devil's Lettuce macroalgae, that are a lot prettier and look a lot nicer. However, they're not going to grow as quickly, so they won't remove as many nutrients as a lot of the quicker growing ones like Chaeto will. Now, the benefit of this quick growing algae is that it will remove nutrients like nitrates and phosphates from your tank. One thing to note is that things like Chaeto and especially some of the red algae like Dragon's Breath do suck up a lot of iron, so it's good to keep an eye on where your iron is at, and in some cases dose some sort of supplement like iron directly, or there's other products such as Chaeto Grow that have things like iron as well as some of the other essential elements in it that you're able to dose. So not only your Chaeto can grow, but also your corals aren't restricted by some of the micronutrients that the Chaeto is consuming. There's other things you can put in here like mangroves as well, but it's important to know that those guys do need a lot of space to grow. We had some in here, but we had to move them out because we're doing an algae treatment on this aquarium. But we did have a lot of mangroves in here growing out, and it's important to have a lot of space for them. Now, when it comes to the lighting, the best thing that I recommend is a Refugium light that cycles on a reverse cycle to your aquarium. So what that means is when your tank lights turn off, this light comes on, and when your tank lights are about to come on, this light goes off. Now, what that does is that actually will help with your pH and maintaining a higher level of it at night, which is when it's most important for the corals, because that's when they're actually developing their skeleton and building it. During the day, all they're doing really is photosynthesizing, and they're not actually using the nutrients that they're creating to build their skeleton. At night, when they are building their skeleton, a higher pH helps to create a better environment for them to combine the calcium and alkalinity that they use to create their skeleton. So having a higher pH is more beneficial at night when you will have this Refugium light on, and this algae will be producing more oxygen, raising your pH and keeping it more stable so you don't have the swings that a lot of people do in between day and night, where during the day you'll typically have higher pHs and then at night it'll typically go down. So again, a Refugium, definitely not a requirement, but a nice addition if you have the space in your sump for it. Now, pods are typically broken up into two main groups: amphipods, which are going to be a little bit bigger, and copepods that are going to be a little bit smaller. These guys look like little bugs, and a lot of times you'll see them on the glass of your aquarium, especially when you're cycling it right at the start. It's definitely not a problem, and they are actually beneficial. Not only will they provide a food source for certain fish like wrasses and dragonets, but even things like clownfish will often peck at them, and they also will be detritivores, which means they'll eat some of the fish waste as well as some of the uneaten food before it can get broken down into things like nitrates and phosphates, which can be harmful to some of your corals and fish. Now, these guys will actually breed in the macroalgae as well as some of the other substrate that you have in there. If you have sand or some rocks in there, they'll breed and use that as an area to lay their eggs and grow. And because there's typically a lot of detritus in that area, because it's a little bit lower flow, they usually have plenty of food to subsist off of. And the benefit of these guys is that they will actually slowly move their way over to your return pump, which is this section here, and they'll get shot back up into the aquarium, providing that food without them getting wiped out by some of the more aggressive predators like wrasses and dragonets that can really trim down the population and almost annihilate it in a display tank, leading to not enough food for some of the harder to keep fish like mandarin dragonets that really are only able to eat those pods. So it's very beneficial to have a Refugium, especially if you're looking to keep fish like that, because you want to get it started a little earlier so you can build up that pod population in order to provide enough food for those guys. Now, I've gone through the basics of filtration, and as you guys saw, we like to keep things really simple here at the shop, mainly just because we have so many systems, and a lot of the other extras just either don't get used or aren't super helpful, and it's a very marginal benefit that they provide a lot of times. But there are definitely a lot of other filtration methods that you can add on to your system that can definitely provide a benefit. For instance, there's a lot of different products like PhosGuard. This is a type of chemical filtration that will help reduce your phosphates. There's a lot of different ones that can do a lot of different things, but those are going to be a lot more specific to your individual use case, and I recommend doing research on each of those products individually before going out and getting it. The next product that I use a lot is going to be Purigen. Now, this will help reduce things like nitrates and phosphates by binding to a lot of the chemicals and waste in the aquarium, and it's definitely a good addition. I usually will just run this and carbon, and I'll add some PhosGuard if my phosphates start to get a little too high. Now, for these guys, you're going to need some sort of mesh bag. I like these with the drawstring because you're able to tie them off, And then once your media is used up, you can open them up and reuse them. It also lets you precisely measure out your chemical filtration. So certain things like PhosGuard are going to remove a specific amount of phosphates. So it's important to properly and accurately dose the amount that you're going to be adding into your aquarium. So that way you don't overstrip your nutrients, leading to even more problems than when you started. Now, another thing you can use is a reactor. So this is quite a big one, but there's a lot of different sizes out there. These guys basically are a housing for your chemical filtration. This one had carbon in it. It's got a small pump at the bottom here that takes your water, pumps it up through your media, and then puts it out of this tube. Now, what this does is it makes sure that all the carbon is interacting with the water and gets you a much more even and cohesive spread across your different filtration media. In this bag, a lot of times you won't get enough flow going through it to hit the very center. So you'll end up with used media on the outside and media that probably still has some life on it in the center. So this is just a little bit better way to use your chemical filtration and get a little bit more use out of it. Now, another product that I would recommend if you're looking to add to your biological filtration is some sort of bacteria. Now, as we talked about in our last video, there are some bacteria that are good for dosing at the beginning of your tank, at the start, like Tim's One and Only. There's also bacteria that are good for adding to your tank once it's already established. My favorite is definitely this one, the EcoBalance. But there are several other brands out there on the market. Brightwell makes one, Seachem makes one, that will help to do the same thing as EcoBalance. I just personally have used it with really great results. Now, dosing bacteria can have a few benefits. One of them is nutrient control. So if your nitrates and phosphates start to get out of control, this can help it because it adds more bacteria to your system, which can process more nutrients. The other thing is if you have some sort of harmful bacteria, something like dinoflagellates or red slime, a more beneficial strain of bacteria can a lot of times outcompete those harmful strains of bacteria and rebalance your different bacterias in your aquarium, thus helping to resolve some of those problems that are a little more persistent and difficult to get rid of because it's a little bit more of a natural way to go about those. More like the ocean, where there are definitely harmful bacteria out there, but there is enough good bacteria to counterbalance that, and this is a very good way to emulate that. All right, so the final kind of filtration that I would recommend, but is definitely not necessary, would be a UV sterilizer. Now, this one we have on our fish system because they are very good for removing any sort of parasites like ick. The main thing you want to remember is that for parasites, it is good to run these at a much lower flow level than they recommend. They usually will have the parasite or protozoa flow rate on the manual or the fact sheet on their website. So it's good to take a look at that and get a pump that's sized for that rather than the bacteria or algae rate. That's usually a little bit faster and what's written like on the box. Now, these UV sterilizers are definitely beneficial for fish because they can help reduce pests and diseases, but they also have, in our experience here at the shop, done a lot of good for reducing things like brown jelly disease and other sorts of pathogens that could be in the water, especially for us because we bring in so many corals. We've noticed a lot less death, and we run UV sterilizers on every single one of our systems. And since we put that on over 2.5 years ago, our rates of disease, and especially disease spread, have dropped significantly. I would say between 50 and 60%. And now we have very little die-off due to disease. And if we do, it usually stays isolated to a singular coral that is usually in our quarantine system because it hasn't gone through our quarantine process yet. And because of that, I definitely would recommend a UV sterilizer. Again, if you have the space, it is definitely not a necessity. And as long as you get your corals from high quality sources, you will typically not run into any issues with any sorts of pathogens or diseases. And really, you will only need this for clarifying your water or keeping fish parasites clear. If you go ahead and get fish from a quarantine source, like us here at Queen City Corals, you can go ahead and remove your UV sterilizer or just set it on a higher level for removing bacterias and things like that. At that point, it's a little more aesthetic than actually practical. So that's why I put it in this category of recommended, but definitely not necessary, especially if you're getting your corals from high quality sources. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to leave a like down below. If you guys have any questions, you can comment those down below and I will try to answer all of them. And if you guys want to stay up to date on all of our different videos coming out, you can subscribe to our channel down here. And I hope you guys have a good one, and I will see you in our next episode.